They say Hollywood never forgets its stars. But what happens when a star refuses to play the game? Picture this. It's April 1991. Cameras are flashing along the Hollywood Walk of Fame. A frail woman steps slowly onto the red carpet. Her body, weakened by disease, barely carries her. But her smile burns like a final candle against the wind. That woman was Lee Remick, once hailed as America's answer to Bridget Bardot. Now barely recognized, even by the industry she helped define. She wasn't there for a comeback. She was there to say goodbye. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That star they unveiled in the pavement? It wasn't just a tribute. It was a public apology disguised in glitter. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the channel where we unravel the stories Hollywood prefers to keep under wraps. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell, because the truth, especially in Tinseltown's, rarely on the marquee. Now, let's ask the question no one dares out loud. Did Lee Remick choose to disappear? Or was she gently erased the moment she stopped playing the role they wrote for her? She wasn't the loudest actress of her era. She didn't spark tabloid feuds or parade personal scandals. But beneath that porcelain grace lived a woman of steel, making quiet choices that cost her everything but integrity. This is not just a biography. This is an autopsy of what Hollywood does to those who refuse to bow. Let's rewind. Born in 1935 in Quincy, Massachusetts, Lee Remick wasn't born into Hollywood. She was born into art. Her mother was an actress. Her father a department store owner with a practical head and working-class roots. She grew up between two worlds, the stage and the sidewalk. When her parents divorced, she followed her mother to New York, a city that, unlike Hollywood, makes no promises. But it did offer Lee a stage, and that was all she needed. At 16, she was already breaking rules. She lied about her age to get into a summer stock theater company in Cape Cod. There was no red carpet, no trailers, just a tent on dirt. And she loved every minute. That summer, she said, was magic. Think about that. No spotlight, no camera crew, just long days, grueling rehearsals, and the pure high of live performance. That's where the theater bug bit her, and it never let go. By the time she turned 17, she'd already made her Broadway debut. And just a few years later, she caught the eye of legendary director Elia Kazan. He cast her in A Face in the Crowd, not as the lead, but as a teenage baton twirler with barely a few minutes of screen time. Yet her presence was undeniable. Critics said she lit up black and white film like it was shot in color. That's not acting. That's presence. And you can't teach that. But Hollywood is rarely satisfied with talent alone. It wants packaging. In 1959, Anatomy of a Murder changed everything. Remick played Laura Manion, a young wife at the heart of a rape-murder trial. The role could have been predictable, a temptress, a pawn. But Lee brought something else: ambiguity. Was she a victim? A liar? Both. In one unforgettable scene, she lounges in capri pants, sunglasses on, answering questions with purring defiance. The audience didn't know whether to trust her or fear her. That tension, that's what made her dangerous. And Hollywood never forgets a woman who makes people uncomfortable. Then came Days of Wine and Roses in 1962, her breakout, her unraveling, and in many ways, her farewell to mainstream stardom. Opposite Jack Lemmon, she played a young wife spiraling into alcoholism. No makeup, no glamour, just raw, haunted truth. Her performance was so naked it made producers nervous. This wasn't an actress playing drunk. This was a woman collapsing from within. For that, she earned an Oscar nomination and a subtle warning from Hollywood: don't do that again. Because here's the thing, studios love a sob story, but only if it's fiction. When the pain feels too real, they pull back. They fear the mirror. And Lee held that mirror up without blinking. Off-screen, Her life was following a parallel arc. She married TV producer Bill Colleran, had 2 children, and did the impossible, tried to balance motherhood with the demands of stardom. But the cracks began to show. By 1968, the marriage was over. And Hollywood? It had already started to look elsewhere. So what did she do? She walked away. Literally. She moved to London with her second husband, British producer William Gowans. No PR tour. No headlines. She left the game without slamming the door, and that silence was deafening. What kind of star gives up Hollywood at the height of her power? Maybe one who never worshipped it to begin with. By the late 70s, she'd reinvented herself as the queen of the miniseries, headlining powerful dramas on television back when TV was considered a step down. But she didn't care. She once said, "I make movies for grown-ups. When Hollywood starts doing that again, I'll start acting in them again." That wasn't a quip. That was a eulogy. So why does this story matter now? Because Lee Remick wasn't just an actress. She was a woman who dared to age, who refused to become a caricature, who didn't chase relevance with scandal or spectacle. She believed in roles that meant something, and when those roles stopped coming, she left. In a time when celebrity culture rewards outrage, viral soundbites, and performative vulnerability, Lee Remick is a haunting reminder of another path. A quieter one. One that doesn't always end in glory but often ends in grace. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the relationships and rumors that swirled around her, including the one involving a certain Kennedy that still sparks whispers today. But before we go there, I ask you, can the industry that trades in dreams ever truly value someone who refuses to sell hers? We left off with a woman who didn't slam the door on Hollywood, she simply stepped away from it. But silence, especially from someone who once commanded both screen and stage, often stirs curiosity more than any scandal could. And in the vacuum Lee Remick left behind, whispers found fertile ground. Some about her career, others more personal. Perhaps the most tantalizing thread in her post-divorce years was the speculation around her connection with Robert F. Kennedy. The timelines intersect. The proximity was real. Her first husband, Bill Colleran, had social ties with the Kennedys. Lee herself had been a frequent guest at White House events during JFK's presidency. She supported Democratic causes. She admired the Kennedy legacy. But admiration has often been misread, and friendships easily reinterpreted, especially when a beautiful woman and a powerful man share too many quiet moments. Biographers have floated the theory for decades that Bobby Kennedy and Lee Remick were more than acquaintances, that in the grief-stricken aftermath of JFK's assassination, RFK grew closer to certain Hollywood figures for comfort, for distraction, maybe for intimacy. Some suggest Lee was among them. There's no hard proof, no love letters, no hotel receipts. But the absence of denial, public or private, was enough to keep the story alive. Even Ethel Kennedy, when pressed years later, dismissed the rumors with a vague shrug rather than a defense, as if to say, even if it happened, it no longer matters. But does it? Because if it did happen, it changes how we see Lee. Not as a reckless figure chasing power, but as a woman who may have been pulled into the orbit of America's most tragic dynasty during its darkest moment. If it didn't happen, then the rumors say even more about a culture that can't accept a woman being both beautiful and principled without assuming ulterior motives. In either case, Lee Remick never commented. Not once. And in that silence, she once again held power. Still, these whispers highlight a larger truth about Hollywood's ecosystem. Fame doesn't just reward talent. It rewards proximity to the right director, the right producer, the right politician. And Lee's position, always on the edge of the inner circle, always just a little too elegant to be tabloid fodder, made her both respected and vulnerable. By the late 60s, She had divorced Colleran and moved to London with William Gowans, a British producer she met on a film set. There was no press blitz, no People magazine spreads, just a quiet shift across the Atlantic away from red carpets, studio contracts, and casting politics, and perhaps also away from the ghosts of both personal and professional entanglements. But she didn't disappear. She evolved. While many actresses of her generation were quietly phased out, pushed toward supporting roles as the industry chased youth, Lee found new ground on television. It's easy to forget now, but in the 70s, the miniseries was a revolution. It gave actors space to explore character depth that movies no longer allowed. And it gave Lee a second act, not just as a star, but as an artist. She portrayed historical figures, literary heroines, broken wives, powerful mothers. In Jenny, Lady Randolph Churchill, she played Winston Churchill's mother across decades of transformation, capturing both the vivacious debutante and the hardened matriarch with remarkable nuance. British critics were stunned. American audiences were moved. She won a Golden Globe and a BAFTA proof that the screen, big or small, couldn't dim her talent. This chapter of her career spanning over a decade cemented her as the reigning queen of the miniseries format. She didn't need blockbusters. She didn't need gossip columns. She needed scripts with weight in television. Surprisingly, delivered. But that raises an uncomfortable point. Why wasn't film offering the same? Was it because she aged? Because she no longer fit the ingenue mold that once defined her early roles? Or was it because she'd made a choice back when few women in her position had the leverage or the will to make it? A choice to value dignity over marketability? Her roles during this period reflected that choice. In Haywire, she played the deeply troubled actress Margaret Sullivan, charting a descent into mental illness with eerie, almost autobiographical precision. In The Women's Room, she explored the transformation of a suburban housewife into a liberated woman, mirroring, perhaps, her own shift from screen beauty to nuanced performer. She even tackled crime dramas, true stories, and character studies rarely written for women in their 40s and 50s. And yet, for all this prestige, Lee Remick remained curiously undercelebrated in mainstream Hollywood circles. She didn't headline major studio films. She wasn't handed legacy awards until the very end. It's as if the industry couldn't quite forgive her for being excellent on her own terms. This tension between a performer's power and a system's neglect is one of the central paradoxes of her story. She had the range. She had the grace. She had the resume. But she never became a household name on the level of Hepburn or Taylor. Maybe because she never wanted to be. Or maybe because she didn't play by the same rules. There's a strange symmetry to how this played out. As she drifted farther from Hollywood's core, her roles became more complex. The fewer interviews she gave, the more respected she became. It was as if the less she tried to be a star, the more she became an actress. But let's not romanticize the exile. This wasn't all serenity and artistic freedom. There were trade-offs. By the time the 80s arrived, Lee had largely vanished from cinema, not by failure but by design. She once said in an interview, "I don't have to prove anything. I've been famous. Now I want to be interesting." It wasn't just a philosophy. It was a quiet indictment of the industry that had made her. Because being famous is easy. You just have to be visible. But being interesting? That requires work. And the older Lee Remick got, the more interesting she became. As the 1980s approached, Lee Remick was no longer on magazine covers or blockbuster posters, but make no mistake, she was far from retired. If anything, she had entered her most subversive and commanding era. While Hollywood studios struggled to write meaningful roles for women over 40, television, especially the emerging format of made-for-TV movies and miniseries, offered a surprising refuge. And Lee? She claimed it as her new stage. What followed was a streak of fearless performances that not only redefined her image, but pushed the boundaries of what female characters were allowed to be on screen. She wasn't chasing glamour. She was confronting grief, addiction, madness, even murder, one complex woman at a time. In the Women's Room, based on Marilyn French's provocative novel, Remick played Myra, a woman whose journey from repressed housewife to self-actualized feminist mirrored the awakening of an entire generation of American women. Set against the backdrop of suburban conformity, this CBS movie didn't shy away from difficult questions about identity, purpose, and the quiet desperation of domestic life. Remick didn't deliver some fiery manifesto. She gave us a character who simply realized she wanted more. That subtle rebellion was far more radical than a speech could ever be. Then came Haywire, where she portrayed the real-life actress Margaret Sullivan, whose public elegance hid a lifetime of emotional pain. The film, based on Sullivan's daughter's memoir, wasn't flattering. It was raw. At times, it was cruel. And that's exactly why Remick was the perfect fit. She understood how to convey vulnerability without pleading for pity. Her performance didn't ask to be liked, it demanded to be understood. And once again, critics responded. Emmy nominations followed, not because she was playing a tragic figure, but because she made that tragedy human. Lee Remick had, by now, become something exceedingly rare in American entertainment, a woman whose career improved with age. Not because she clung to youth, but because she leaned into experience. She no longer portrayed the ingenue. She was now the weary mother, the haunted wife, the calculating manipulator. And yet, through it all, she retained that unmistakable quality grace. In The Letter, a television remake of the classic Bette Davis film, she played a woman who murders her lover and must construct a story convincing enough to protect her reputation. Unlike Davis's icy delivery, Remick offered a softer edge, one that hinted at guilt, repression, even sexual desperation. She didn't play a villain. She played a woman pushed to the brink. It's a subtle shift, but an important one, because that's where Remick excelled, in the in-between spaces, where easy judgments fall apart. Perhaps her boldest departure from her traditional image came with Nutcracker, Money, Madness and Murder, based on a real-life crime. In it, Remick portrayed Frances Schroeder, a New York socialite so manipulative, so obsessed with control, that she convinced her own son to kill his grandfather for inheritance money. This wasn't a tragic heroine. It was a monster wrapped in silk. And yet, Remick didn't overplay her. She resisted the temptation to turn Frances into a cartoon villain. Instead, she made her horrifyingly plausibly a mother who used affection like a weapon, and charm as camouflage. Critics were stunned. Audiences were fascinated. And once again, she earned awards recognition. Not because she shocked viewers, but because she showed them the humanity behind even the ugliest acts. What these roles reveal is not just her range, but her intent. Remick wasn't working for applause. She was working for truth. In each of these characters, alcoholics, adulteresses, killers, she asked the same question. What drives a woman to this point? And more importantly, what happens when no one is listening to her until she breaks? It's a question Hollywood has historically avoided. Complex women make audiences uncomfortable. They don't sell perfume or movie tickets quite as easily. But on television, where ratings mattered but reputations even more, Lee found space to speak honestly. And television, in turn, respected her. She became a trusted facious stamp of quality. When her name appeared in the credits, viewers knew what to expect: nuance, elegance, and pain delivered without sentimentality. She wasn't there to comfort you. She was there to challenge what you thought you knew about womanhood. Her performances during this decade weren't just acting exercises. They were quiet revolutions. In Tough Love, She played the mother of a drug-addicted teen, forced to make an agonizing decision to save her child. The movie didn't offer clean solutions or easy redemption. Remick portrayed the mother's torment not with speeches, but with silence's moments where love felt indistinguishable from punishment. These were the kinds of emotional terrains mainstream film had stopped exploring. But Lee hadn't, and even in ensemble pieces, she stood out. In The Blue Night, opposite William Holden, she played a compassionate sex worker who sees more truth in the hardened cop than he does in himself. It was a performance filled with dignity, defying every stereotype the role could have fallen into. She once joked that TV allowed her to play all the characters film had stopped writing: alcoholics, adulteresses, murderers' fun parts. She said, with a wink. But there was a deeper truth beneath the humor. On television, she was no longer limited by youth, or beauty, or box office returns. She was free. Still, we'd be naive to think this was a simple happy ending. Her shift to television was born, at least partly, out of necessity. Studios weren't writing layered roles for women over 40. And Remick, unlike some of her peers, refused to settle for caricatures. She wouldn't play the mom or the wife if that was all the script gave her. She wanted stakes. She wanted meaning. And in demanding more, she chose a path that offered less visibility but far more integrity. This, perhaps, is where the system failed her most. Because while her work was critically acclaimed, it never generated the mass hysteria or legacy preservation of her contemporaries. No statues, no national tributes, just a growing list of award nominations and a fan base that quietly dwindled with time. Hollywood forgot her while she was still alive. But even the most enduring grace eventually collides with time and fate. By the end of the 1980s, Lee Remick seemed to be entering a reflective phase of her life. The work had slowed, but the standard remained. Her performances still carried weight. Her name still stood for substance, not scandal. And then, without fanfare, the curtain began to close. In the spring of 1989, while working on location in France for a film project, Lee began experiencing persistent fatigue and back pain. These were not unusual complaints for a woman in her early 50s until they refused to subside. Tests followed, then more tests, and finally, the verdict that changed everything: advanced cancer. Tumors in her kidneys and lungs. The prognosis was grim. Now, here's where the story diverges from the typical Hollywood script. There were no press releases, no exclusive interviews, no public disclosure at all. Lee kept her diagnosis tightly guarded, sharing the truth only with her closest friends and family. In an industry addicted to exposure, where even pain becomes performance, she chose silence, and that silence speaks volumes. It wasn't denial. It was dignity. She wasn't interested in making her illness part of a narrative arc. She didn't want pity. What she had always wanted was control over her own story. That's not an easy thing to maintain when your career was built in front of a lens. But Lee, as ever, managed it. To the outside world, she simply disappeared. Audiences assumed she'd retired. Maybe she was living in England. Maybe she was just choosing a quieter life. That assumption wasn't entirely wrong, but it missed the most important truth. She was fighting for her life. Privately, with the same quiet steel she had shown in her career. For a brief time, there was hope. After aggressive treatments, the cancer went into remission in 1990. Lee, ever the optimist, began planning a return to the stage. Not just any role. She was cast as Desiree Armfeldt in A Little Night Music, Stephen Sondheim's bittersweet musical. It would have been a full-circle moment, a chance to sing Send in the Clowns on stage, to reclaim her Broadway roots in a role perfectly tailored to her age and elegance. But fate, as always, had a cruel sense of timing. Just as rehearsals were set to begin, the cancer returned, this time spreading to her liver. The comeback was canceled. Quietly, without press or protest, she stepped back once more, knowing the fight had entered its final phase. Still, even in that moment, she found humor. She reportedly told the show's director, "At least I know when to quit while I'm ahead." That line half-joke, half-truth sums up the paradox of Lee Remick, a woman who took life seriously but never herself too much. In early 1991, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She and her husband, Kip Gowans, moved back to Los Angeles to be closer to her children and what remained of the film community she once helped shape. Word of her illness began to trickle into the industry, and suddenly, Hollywood remembered. Awards and honors started to arrive, not out of trend, but out of urgency. The Women's International Center gave her a Living Legacy Award in January. Too ill to attend, she recorded a video message, gracious, heartfelt, sincere. No makeup, no pretense, just gratitude. And that, ironically, became her final starring role. But it was what came next that truly etched itself into Hollywood's memory. On April 29, 1991, Lee Remick appeared in public for the last time. The occasion? Her long-overdue star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It should have been a triumphant return. Instead, it was something far more powerful, a goodbye in plain sight. She arrived in a tailored suit and hat, visibly weakened, her face swollen from medication, her movements careful, and yet, as the veil was pulled back on her star, she smiled bright, generous, proud. It wasn't just a smile for the cameras. It was defiance. One last act of presence in a town that had long since turned the spotlight elsewhere. Jack Lemmon, her longtime friend and Days of Wine and Roses co-star, stood beside her, holding her arm. "I love you, kid," he whispered. Her response, just as understated, "I know." That image, two legends bound not by headlines, but by respect, is perhaps more revealing than any career retrospective. It was Hollywood at its rarest, sincere. What makes this moment so poignant is what it represents in contrast. Lee Remick didn't get the grand tributes during her peak. No Vanity Fair spreads. No endless award montages. But at the end, the town paused, just long enough to remember what it once had and what it had so easily let go. In May of that year, another tribute was held aboard the Queen Mary in Long Beach, a formal dinner honoring her contributions, especially in bringing historical women like Jenny Churchill to life. Gravely ill, Lee still attended. Gregory Peck delivered a moving speech, recalling not just her performances, but her presence, the way she elevated every man she worked with, the way her clarity of character made even flawed scripts feel honest. A clip from Jenny was shown on screen. The young Lee, radiant, sharp, alive, appeared for all to see. Lee, sitting at a banquet table, whispered to a friend beside her, "I was beautiful then." The friend replied, "Lee, you still have those eyes." There are no words more fitting, because those eyes, full of intelligence, pain, and unspoken strength, had always told the real story. Not the reviews, not the filmography. The gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and refused to be anything else. On July 2nd, 1991, just 2 months later, Lee Remick died in her Los Angeles home. She was 55. The announcement was brief. The mourning, quiet. There were no televised specials, no national moments of silence. Just a short list of statements from those who had known her, worked with her, and loved her. Jack Lemmon called her one of the most decent and talented people I've ever known. Blake Edwards simply said she was grace incarnate. It's hard to argue with that. Now, in the silence after her passing, we're left with something few stars ever leave behind: dignity unsold. In a town where reinvention is often code for surrender, Lee Remick refused to let the industry or the public redefine her. And in doing so, she exposed one of Hollywood's most enduring truths. Not all erasures are accidental. Some are strategic. Because let's be honest, by the metrics that Hollywood respects most, Lee Remick didn't play the game correctly. She didn't cling to youth with cosmetic desperation. She didn't remarry into fame or make a spectacle of her struggles. She didn't ride the nostalgia train on talk shows or pitch herself to tabloids for relevance. She simply lived. And that, ironically, made her forgettable to the machine that once promoted her. Let's revisit the facts. By age 25, Lee had already conquered Broadway, won critical acclaim in one of the most provocative films of the decade, Anatomy of a Murder, and delivered a shattering performance in Days of Wine and Roses that still haunts anyone who has ever witnessed addiction up close. She had range. She had discipline. She had what every studio said it wanted in a leading lady. But unlike others, she never cultivated fame as its own currency. She used it, occasionally, to get better scripts. But she never let it define her. When she stepped out of the spotlight, she didn't leave breadcrumbs for the press to follow. She simply stopped showing up. And in Hollywood, not showing up is an act of rebellion. Why? Because this industry feeds on availability. Not just physical, but emotional. It wants you raw, open, desperate. It wants the tears and the breakdowns. It wants the comeback stories soaked in humiliation. Lee gave them none of that. And so, slowly but surely, the industry closed its eyes. There's something deeply revealing in how Hollywood responded to her illness and death. It didn't know what to do with her. There was no grand montage at the Oscars, no Lifetime Achievement Award, no retrospective film festival. The people who worked with her mourned her, but the industry itself moved on, with the awkward silence of someone realizing too late that they misjudged a person entirely. Because Lee Remick's career wasn't just impressive, it was instructive. She was a template for a different kind of stardom, one not built on artifice, but on choices. Her roles weren't always high profile, but they were deliberate. From courtroom thrillers to miniseries about war, motherhood, or moral breakdown, she searched for characters who had internal conflict. Not easy heroes, not romantic ornaments. Women on the edge of collapse, transformation, or both. And that's what set her apart. Take her performance in The Medusa Touch, opposite Richard Burton. The film itself was high concept telekinesis, murder, the occult, but Lee played her part with grounded restraint. While others chewed scenery, she anchored the film emotionally, as if she were in a different, better movie entirely. That was her skill, elevating everything around her, often without fanfare. In The Europeans, she brought quiet elegance to a role that could have easily vanished behind period costumes. She understood subtext. She understood how to let silence say more than monologue. In a profession increasingly dominated by volume and spectacle, her understatement felt revolutionary. And yet, her legacy remains fragmented. Mention her name today, and many respond with a pause. Lee Remick. Wasn't she in something with Jack Lemmon? They remember the face, the voice, but not the body of work, not the defiance, not the consistency. And that's where we must ask, why? Why does the culture remember some stars so vividly while allowing others, often more principled, to fade? Is it charisma? Timing? Or is it compliance? Because when you look at the stars who are endlessly recycled in public memory, a pattern emerges. They played the game. They gave the interviews. They opened the doors. Lee didn't. And while her work was, in many cases, stronger than her more celebrated peers, it lacked the narrative hook the industry prefers. She didn't crash and burn. She didn't rise and fall. She simply performed, receded, and left behind a body of work that critics respected but the culture didn't canonize. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that Lee Remick died young, but that she lived authentically. And for that, we allowed her to be erased. Not fully. Of course, there are fans who remember, actors who cite her as an influence, directors who speak of her glow with reverence. But there's no museum wing, no biopic, no coffee table book in the celebrity gift shop. Because Lee Remick was never a brand. She was a person, a performer, a professional, and in today's terms, that may as well be a vanishing species. Her children, Kate and Matt, gave the most poignant tribute at her funeral. Standing before a small, private crowd, they sang "Anyone Can Whistle," the title song from the short-lived Sondheim musical their mother had headlined decades earlier. The show had flopped, but she had loved it, because it was strange, and sincere, and brave. Like her, that moment, two voices singing a song about being misunderstood. In honor of a mother who refused to be simplified may be the most honest summation of her legacy. She didn't win the game. She rewrote the rules. Quietly. Let's go back to that final public moment. April 29th, 1991. Hollywood Boulevard. The crowd is modest. The cameras, fewer than they once were. But they're still watching. And in the middle of it stands Lee Remick, frail, swollen from illness, barely able to stand without support. Yet somehow, impossibly, she radiates poise. In her tailored suit and soft smile, she doesn't look like a woman seeking applause. She looks like someone saying goodbye. That wasn't just a walk of fame ceremony. It was a reckoning. Because for decades, the industry had marketed her image, banked her talent, then moved on. But now, as her body weakened and time ran out, Hollywood was forced just briefly to confront what it had taken for granted. And the applause that day, it wasn't just for the roles. It was for the silence between them, the choices, the refusal to play along when the game changed, the courage to disappear on her own terms, and the quiet grace to re-emerge only when it truly mattered. That image of Jack Lemmon, teary-eyed, holding her arm and whispering, "I love you, kid," cuts deeper than any scripted farewell. It tells you what mattered most in the end. Not the awards, not the headlines, but respect. Real, earned, enduring respect. And it's that quality, more than anything else, that's vanishing from the modern mythology of stardom. Because let's face it, if Lee Remick's career had happened today, in an era of constant visibility, of algorithm-driven fame, of content over craft, would she even be given the chance to rise? Would the quiet precision of her performances survive the noise of celebrity culture? Or would she be dismissed too early, too quickly, for not being marketable enough, viral enough, loud enough? That's the question we're left with. Because Lee's story is not just about talent, it's about restraint. In an industry that rewards self-exposure, she protected her privacy. In a system that praises reinvention, she chose consistency. In a culture that demands dramatic downfall and public redemption, she gave neither. And that, ironically, may be the reason she's not more widely remembered. She didn't implode. She didn't self-destruct. She didn't chase the spotlight when it drifted away. She didn't need to. Because her work, especially in its quietest moments, spoke loudly enough. But here's the thing. Remembrance isn't about what we're told to remember. It's about what we choose to carry forward. So what should we carry from Lee Remick? Not just her filmography, though it's worth revisiting. Not just her performances, though they remain masterclasses in emotional discipline. What we should carry is her ethic, her refusal to trade authenticity for approval, her unwillingness to turn herself into a brand, her belief that doing the work well was enough. In a sense, she offered a roadmap for a kind of stardom that no longer exists or is at least dangerously rare. one that prioritizes craft over currency, one that allows women to age without shame, one that treats the audience as intelligent and the art as sacred. Her life reminds us that it's possible to be brilliant without being bombastic. That being seen is not always the same as being understood. And that sometimes, the most radical thing an artist can do is step away. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. Because while she played women unraveling, struggling, breaking apart, Lee herself remained remarkably whole. Even when the industry forgot her, even when illness stole her voice, even when death came too soon, she didn't crumble. She exited the stage the way she entered it, on her own terms. And perhaps the real question isn't why Lee Remick is underremembered. The question is, what does it say about us that she is? Have we become so conditioned to value spectacle over substance that we no longer recognize depth when it refuses to scream for attention? Have we built an entertainment culture that only immortalizes those who conform to the narrative rise, fall, beg for relevance, repeat? Or are we simply afraid to honor someone who never played the part we expected? Because in the end, Lee Remick's story is not a tragedy. It's a test of our memory, a test of our values, a test of how we define legacy. Do we remember the ones who made the most noise, or the ones who made the most impact in silence? Lee Remick didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be rewritten. She didn't need to be rebranded. What she needed and still needs is to be recognized for what she was. A woman of intelligence, of control, of uncompromising elegance. A woman who walked away from the center not because she was losing, but because she knew the center was shifting into something she no longer respected. And in doing so, she gave us something even more precious than fame. She gave us an example. So the next time we talk about forgotten legends, about underappreciated talent, about stars who deserved better, let's not just say their names. Let's ask why we forgot them in the first place. And let's make sure we don't do it again. Maybe what unsettles us most about Lee Remick isn't how she died, but how she lived. Without scandal, without spectacle, without begging to be remembered. Maybe that's the quiet rebellion we never saw coming. She didn't claw for fame, and she didn't cling to it either. She simply did the work beautifully, consistently, and with integrity. And when the lights faded, she let them. No curtain call, no scripted farewell, just silence and a smile. So perhaps the real question isn't about her legacy, but about our ability to recognize value that doesn't demand our attention. In a culture obsessed with noise, are we still capable of honoring those who speak in whispers? In a world where visibility is mistaken for relevance, can we still see the ones who chose to disappear with grace? Or have we lost something essential, something that once defined not just our icons, but our ideals? Lee Remick's story doesn't ask for your sympathy, but it may ask for your memory. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink what it means to truly live with purpose, then let's keep these conversations alive. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a truth that was almost forgotten, or a legacy the world tried to erase. Until next time.